Hello and welcome to this screencast on The End of Empire, the penultimate chapter in Bentley and Ziegler's Traditions and Encounters, 5th edition. This chapter, as the title suggests, focuses on the key concept of decolonization. So you want to look for that. Now, that will intersect with other big developments in the 20th century, like the Cold War and rapid technological change. So you want to look for that big idea and then how it is context for or is influenced by some of these other big themes. So let's roll. Some useful vocabulary here, so you might pause and take a look. The one that I would highlight here is the fourth one. That the word colored is that's used in South Africa or was used in South Africa and would still be used in speech. But during apartheid, during the time of this chapter, that was a legal designation for a person who had more than one racial ancestry as defined by the apartheid state. So mostly people who had both black and white ancestry. So that was a legal designation and it meant something different than what that word has meant at different times in US history. So it's much more specific to that group. So just FYI as you hit that. Okay. As I mentioned, the scientific and technological changes that were very rapidly occurring in the 20th century are a big part of this chapter. And these new nations, including India, is a big example, had to make choices or were confronted with changes presented by the developments in agriculture that we call the Green Revolution. So green here means like, plants, you know, chlorophyll and stuff, photosynthesis. And so the first two stars there show changes that were happening. And some of that was pioneered by Cresco, Iowa's favorite son, Norman Borlaug, who worked at the University of Minnesota. And he helped develop some of these seeds. But the Green Revolution also involves these other inputs. Now, this is going to, or had the result of much more food production, especially of like basic staple crops, like main food crops that fill people up, like wheat and rice and corn. And so that's going to allow growth in population. But there's also large social effects that come from this because they're going to contribute to the process of outmigration from rural areas because more capital investment is being used to increase production, and that means less labor. Another way to think of that is that small farmers can't compete because they can't afford to make the investments in agriculture, like buying all these things before they plant and harvest, in order to compete against larger, more capitalized, which means has more investment money in it, operations that are producing higher yields and then pushing the price down. So the good news for people who eat food is the price of food was going down. That is not good news always for people producing food because many of them could no longer compete and had to give up their land or were working for lower wages if they were wage workers. So the social effects are more mixed. Okay. So it's something to take a look at. I'd say the most important person who's kind of a shadow figure in this chapter is Deng Xiaoping. That is one name that I would add into your notes about this time period. So Deng Xiaoping was a Chinese Communist Party leader, and he was responsible for, at least as much as anyone, the transition of the People's Republic of China from a state-controlled hardline communist state economically to one that was a mixed economy with capitalist and socialist elements. That is very much a part of our world today. Under Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese Communist Party remained in complete political control, as it does now. So China was a repressive one party state, was and is, including violence against protesters at Tiananmen, that you'll see. I think that's in chapter 38. But also, this change made China, the world's fastest growing economy after 1979. So, with those things happening, here's decolonization, and the first bit of that looks like I'm on Gandhi's newspaper here a little bit. I'll just leave that. So, at its most basic meaning, decolonization means that there were many new states. So, when the United Nations began, there were about 50 countries there, mostly American and European. And then today, there's more than 150. So, it's more than tripled in size. And those new states are almost all former colonies. That or former parts of communist states, like the former USSR and the former Yugoslavia. So, you're kind of looking out for that, and how did that happen? So, we'll see Gandhi. This process could be violent. And as you think about that, one thing you can think of is, why does that happen in some places and not in others? And I think there's two variables that are most likely to produce violence in the decolonization process. And one of those is the presence of settlers from the colonial country who aren't going to leave. And so they're more likely just to straight resist. And there's two examples there, and the war in Algeria, which is right across the Mediterranean Sea from France, and where 1/8 of the population considered themselves ethnically French and not Arab and Algerian. They It was especially nasty. And then the Cold War could also make things more lethal. So Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, the French resisted giving up control over those colonies, but then the Cold War increased the amount of firepower in those conflicts that greatly increased the casualties, the suffering from that. Nicaragua is an interesting example because that would be neo-colonialism. Nicaragua had been independent since the 19th century, but the struggle between Nicaraguans, which was related to neo-colonialism, became much more violent as a result of the Cold War. Okay. As part of this independence, India and Pakistan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories are areas that had been colonies, or in the case of Israel, Palestine, a mandate, so kind of semi-colonial state before World War II, and then became independent. And because of ethnic, cultural conflict in those places, also religious conflict, and kind of in the case of India, Pakistan, the countries were partitioned as they became independent, which seemed like probably to some people a way to resolve some of those tensions. But in reality, there's no good place to draw these lines, or at least no perfect place. Some are probably better than others to draw lines that partition, divide these places into parts. And the result was suffering and ongoing conflict. And then finally, in terms of, again, thinking of neo-colonialism, we have Latin American struggles for economic stability in this time. And that comes from the role of most Latin American countries. Although this is also true for the former colonies in Africa in different ways. Latin American countries dependent on exports of primary commodities. So that's things like coffee. I was going to say gold, but maybe, yeah, there is some of that, but also copper, um, sugar cane, still those kinds of things, beef. It's just on and on. List of commodities, like primary commodities. The prices of those things go up and down like wildly, and in and of itself, that's not a bad thing. But if a country is overly dependent on a few products for its export earnings, then that is going to make things like budgeting at the national government level very difficult, and that's gonna make things less stable, and will also help explain why people in Latin America and Africa, for example, might have different views of global capitalism and globalization than people in what's sometimes called the global north, or what used to be called the first world, you know, where we get low prices and fantastic stuff from around the world. Globalization is going to look different to people in that situation than people who are on the primary commodity part of the system. So that's the deal. All right, take a look out for decolonization and its complications as you read chapter 37. Thanks for listening, and we will have one more. I don't know what I'll do for chapter 38, but it's coming.